We'll just give it a couple of seconds for people to join in. Okay, I think we can start. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this EPC policy dialogue entitled U.S. Policy Towards the Middle East. Is there a role for the EU? My name is Mihai Chihaia. I'm a policy analyst with the European Policy Center, and I have the pleasure of moderating this discussion. As we're already a few months in the Biden administration, now over 100 days, this is a timely discussion to look at the Biden administration has brought in its policy towards the Middle East. What are the priorities? What has been achieved so far, and what role the EU could play, is already playing or could play in the near future. So there is a range of strategic choices that the Biden administration has, ranging from outlining the priorities, dedicating resources to these priorities, shaping cooperation with partners, recalibrating cooperation with some US partners in the region, the approach towards Iran, the future policy towards Iran, and opportunities for transatlantic cooperation. So there are a couple of key questions that need to be addressed, such as what are the changes that the Biden administration brings, what are the prospects for the US-EU cooperation in the region, how will US tackle the growing influence of Russia and China in the region. And to answer these questions, we have an excellent panel today with us, a panel comprising of Dr. Lina Khatib, who is director of the Middle East and North Africa program at the Chatham House, who has an extensive experience on the Middle East, and he's been quoted frequently in the media all across the globe. Then we have Ambassador Daniel Kurtzer. He's a former US ambassador to Egypt and Israel. He's currently a professor at Princeton University and has an extensive experience for the US government working on Middle East issues. And last but not least, we have Dr. Trita Parsi, who is the vice president of the Quincy Institute, a well-renowned expert on the Middle East and Iran in particular. Just before we start discussion, maybe a couple of logistical aspects. In order to ask a question, you can type it in the Q&A box, which is at the bottom of your screen, or you can just hit the raise your hand button, and then I will give you the floor and you can ask your question directly, and my colleagues will unmute you. Please keep your questions short and then ask them all across the event. The event is only a 1-hour discussion, so please feel free to pose your question at any point. And without further ado, I would start maybe with you, Lina, and maybe ask you to outline what are the main priorities for the US in the Middle East, and what role do you see for the EU? The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the invitation today. I think, unfortunately, I'm going to start by saying that I don't think the Middle East is a priority for this administration in the United States. Having said that, there are a number of things that I'm detecting, although it's very early days. One of the issues is that it seems to me the US is more interested in containment in the Middle East rather than a resolution of some of the conflicts. In particular, this applies to the Syrian conflict, where I think the approach taken by the US so far appears to be more about compartmentalizing the conflict, trying to limit its impact outside Syria, but without taking steps to really resolve it. Where I see a bit more movement is on the Yemen conflict. I think the US is perhaps more interested in resolving that. I don't think that this is necessarily a bad thing, focusing on Yemen before Syria, because Yemen is a much easier conflict to resolve. And perhaps if the United States manages to draw the Yemen conflict towards some sort of resolution, maybe this can pave the way for some resolution on Syria further down the line. But my big concern here is to do with Iran, because Iran looms large in the region as a destabilizing force. And right now, there are indicators that the US wants to rejoin the nuclear deal. In my view, the nuclear deal is important. However, it is not sufficient. And in my personal opinion, the mistakes of the previous two administrations were detaching the nuclear issue from Iran's regional role at large. I think focusing just on the nuclear issue meant that Syria had to pay a high price. And frankly, today, even Israel's security is at risk as a result. So I personally hope that the administration will indeed run a parallel track regarding Iran's regional role and negotiate with Iran on that basis. And here the EU and Europe can play a role. I think they can play a role in having indirect talks between Iran and the US, not just on the nuclear issue, as is currently the case, but on the regional issue as well. I think the EU in general, sadly, does not have a distinct policy regarding the Middle East. It is mostly waiting for a sign from Washington. And if Washington doesn't give that sign, then the EU's role will be reduced to just humanitarian aid, aid for civil society, keeping sanctions on board, which I think is important, but also sanctions are necessary but not sufficient to really either impact change or, more than that, enact political transformation, say in the case of Syria. So I see the EU as playing a supportive role to the US. However, we need US leadership, and so far it is too early to tell. The signs seem to be of an administration that is following the quiet path. Let's see if this changes. And this is where I will stop. There'll be a lot more to say later on. Thank you.
No, thank you very much. Lina, you already outlined some key issues such as Syria, such as Yemen, such as Iran, but maybe I'll just stop on one issue that you mentioned. You mentioned that the EU is playing a supportive role. Do you think that this will change in the coming years, or do you see the EU continuing to play this supportive role?
I mean, so far, it seems to me that the EU is not striking its own path regarding the Middle East. You'd think that the EU would have the Middle East higher up on its list of priorities because of the geographical proximity at the very least. However, the EU, unfortunately, does not have the capacity to influence the region in a great deal. That doesn't mean that the EU cannot do anything. For example, on the issue of assistance to countries like Egypt, for example, I think the EU can push for reforms on the human rights front. Same with any assistance to Lebanon, which is now suffering from a very severe economic crisis. I think the EU and European countries can push for reform as a condition for foreign aid and even trade and other economic agreements. So the EU can do that, but I just don't see the EU heading in the direction of striking a divergent path from that of the US.
Thank you. I will maybe just now turn to you, Dan, for a couple of thoughts on the US policy towards the Middle East. The floor is yours.
Sure, thank you. And thank you for the invitation to join you. Look, the starting point to understand the Biden administration's approach to anything is to understand how they see what they inherited from the past 4 years. It is probably the most challenging domestic agenda of any president since Franklin D. Roosevelt before World War II. And Biden has indicated already the degree to which he is prepared to think big and to think as a transformational president rather than simply repairing the damage of the past number of years. This is particularly challenging because of the partisan nature of American politics, which seems to get worse with every passing year. And so the administration is totally absorbed with trying to deal with and maybe fix problems in the United States related to the comeback of the economy after COVID, race relations, immigration, particularly the challenges at the southern border, healthcare reform. In other words, all of the issues that were exacerbated by policies with which the Biden administration was totally at odds under former President Donald Trump. In that context, the administration is making very judicious choices with respect to foreign affairs generally. The most important agenda item there, of course, is China or China and Russia. And you can see that the Middle East begins to fall down the priority list. Within the Middle East, I think, as Lina indicated, probably the most important issue for the administration is Iran. And after what appears to be a significant debate among the senior officials in the administration, they seem to have focused now on getting back into the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action as soon as possible as a prelude to trying to deal with Iran on the other issues with which the United States has so many problems, whether it's Iran's aggressive activities in places like Syria or Yemen, whether it's missile development, support for terrorism, and the like. But this seems to be the highest immediate priority in a region which is not a priority region for the administration. If we looked at a second priority for Washington, it's remains counterterrorism. We certainly dealt a blow with the international coalition against ISIS, but ISIS is not dead. Al-Qaeda is not dead. And the children of these organizations continue to create problems, not only in this region, but outside as well. Almost any other issue for the administration seems to be in something of a holding pattern. With regard to Israel-Palestine, the administration is trying to fix some of the worst policies of the Trump administration, for example, resuming assistance to Palestinians, reopening communications channels. But it would be, I think, too much to expect the administration to be considering a major initiative. With respect to North Africa, one of the major policy issues to be thought about is whether or not to accept the Trump administration's recognition of Moroccan sovereignty in Western Sahara. This is a big issue among certain members of the United States Senate, and the administration has not yet pronounced itself. With regard to, finally, to the other points that Lina mentioned, dealing with these endemic conflicts in Syria, Yemen, and Libya, the administration will probably be in pretty much of a holding pattern, meaning that it will work with the United Nations and other partners to see whether or not conflict resolution or conflict mitigation is possible, but is unlikely to take a leading role in almost any of these situations. This may be a place where cooperation with the EU may be most pronounced because the United States has its own interests, but understands that the EU in some cases has an even more significant interest, specifically with regard to the movement of refugees and the impact that that has on Europe. And so just to sum up this short introduction, there are places in which the United States and the European Union can cooperate. One of them, of course, is going to be on the return to the JCPOA, which is structurally built into that negotiation. But on the regional conflicts, there is certainly room for cooperation on those issues that are very important to the EU, important to the United States, but of a secondary or even tertiary level of interest. But other than that, I think we're going to see a United States that kind of has a holding pattern for a while, except on those two big issues of Iran and counterterrorism.
Thank you, Dan, for following up on these points, also on what Lina had mentioned. Maybe just to follow up, I think back in December you wrote an article together with Aaron Miller in which you outlined the importance of a multilateral approach towards the Middle East. How would this multilateral approach work in practice? What do you mean by it?
Well, the argument that we made was to look at several different clusters of issues. Our model was actually the Conference of Security and Cooperation in Europe 70 years ago, which led to the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe. And so we tried to divide the issues conceptually into various, that used to be called baskets or clusters, of security, humanitarian affairs, economic affairs, and so forth. And in several of them, there's no question that multilateral cooperation is a force multiplier, whereas the United States carries a great deal of weight in terms of its own power, working together with Europe and others outside of Europe. We could actually begin to develop structures and processes for dealing with issues. The objective was fairly modest. There was no sense that this multilateral approach was necessarily going to yield major successes right away. But the idea was to get people to start talking to each other again, largely as we had accomplished after the Madrid conference in the 1990s, when we had the multilateral talks in 5 different categories. That's the thought. I haven't seen any evidence yet that the administration has adopted it as a concept, but it's certainly out there as something that I think Europeans and Americans can be talking about.
Thank you, Dan. Now over to you, Trita, for a couple of thoughts.
Thank you so much. Great pleasure being with all of you and with Lina and Dan. I find myself largely in agreement with Dan in the sense that this administration clearly has its domestic agenda at the forefront. They've made no secret of that. And as a result, that is what they're going to be spending most of their resources on and most of their political capital. They're going to be risk averse when it comes to engaging in foreign policy issues that will consume some of that political capital that they believe that they have better use for domestically when it gets to, passing the COVID relief fund, for instance, which was passed, getting their nominations through the Senate, etc. But having said that, I think there were clear signs earlier on that the Biden administration was leaning towards de-emphasizing the Middle East, shifting its focus eastwards, viewing the engagement in the Middle East as no longer being of the same level of strategic significance to the United States as it was before. Interviews that Biden gave during the campaign, particularly during the primary, I think signaled this. We had pieces by Jake Sullivan, who is now his national security advisor, talking about reducing the military footprint of the United States in the Middle East while boosting diplomatic engagement. And that's perhaps what we not have seen. I may differ a bit with Lina on this point, though. I don't think this is a bad thing. First of all, U.S. foreign policy should be structured around U.S. national interest. The United States is not a charity, and as a result should be engaging in things in manners that are actually beneficial to its interests. But I also think that there's signs that a lesser prominent U.S. leadership role in the region actually creates space for regional powers themselves to finally start taking more responsibility for their own security and manage those crises and those disputes that they have diplomatically. I think it's quite fascinating to see that as a result of Biden coming in, as a result of Biden signaling that he's going to rejoin the JCPOA, signaling that he will be leaving Afghanistan, that we now have a situation in which the Saudis, Iranians, Jordanians, and Egyptians have been engaging in secret talks in Iraq, mediated by the Iraqis, who have a clear interest in reducing Saudi-Iranian tensions because Saudi-Iranian tensions, unfortunately, play out inside of Iraq. I don't think we would have seen this had it not been for the fact that the Saudis have been increasingly convinced that the United States is going to disengage militarily from the region, not perhaps entirely, but that's the trend. That trend is going to intensify and continue. And under those circumstances, suddenly options such as engaging in direct diplomacy with some of the other countries in the region that were not as attractive before, when the Saudis thought that they could simply rely on the United States handling those issues for it, resolving those problems for it. Now suddenly diplomacy starts to become much more attractive because other options don't exist. Ultimately, this is a good thing because only sustainable solution to stability and security in the region is that the regional powers take that responsibility on their own and that they have ownership of that process rather than that process being led and driven and at times imposed by outside powers. That does not mean, however, that the United States or the Europeans cannot play a helpful role. In particular, I think the Europeans can play a tremendously helpful role. The Europeans have extremely valuable experience transitioning the paradigm of security in Europe away from balance of power towards collective security. You have examples with the OSCE and other things that can be of tremendous value. I think the Europeans also are less embroiled in some of the conflicts in the region, which makes their mediation perhaps more effective. The United States, unfortunately, has ended up becoming a party to many of the conflicts in the region, and as a result has a more difficult time playing that type of a mediation role. The Europeans can be quite helpful, both to the region and to the United States on these issues. It will require, however, as I think was hinted at earlier on, a bit more of a decisive as well as autonomous European posture in the region and in general. And I don't think we have seen that yet, but the opportunity lies there in front of Europe. The question is as to whether Europe wants it or not. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Trita. This is very useful. Maybe just to follow up on one point. Back in January, when we had an event at EPC where you joined on Iran, we agreed that the EU must be more proactive in bringing the US back to the JCPOA and also bringing Iran back to compliance. Has this happened? What's the current state of play in Vienna?
Well, I would give a lot of credit to the EEAS. I think the EEAS has played a tremendously important and crucial role in bringing it together. I mean, right now, since the Iranians refuse to talk to the US until the US is back into the deal, it is up to the EEAS to do the mediation between the US and Iran, which is extremely difficult, extremely time-consuming, and far less effective than if the Iranians and the Americans were talking to each other directly. But in the absence of the EEAS, there probably wouldn't have been any effective partner that could have done this. So I think the EEAS has played a tremendously useful role. I'm not as clear about where the E3 is. Some of the statements that have come out seems to suggest that they have sought to adopt a position to the right of the Biden administration. I don't know if that's a calculated move in concert with the Biden administration, or if that is one form of manifestation of European autonomy. But it is in the European autonomy in that case that is in contrast to what the EAS is doing. And that's ultimately not a good thing. It's much better if the two sides are, the two parties that constitute the EU are actually entirely on the same page.
Maybe another quick question on this. Do you see any impact of the Natanz attack on the negotiations? Has it changed in any way the dynamics of the negotiation?
Well, one of the things that it immediately did, of course, is that it created a situation in which the Iranians went up to 60% enriched uranium. This is something that they have never done before. This is tremendously negative, and I think it signals that at the end of the day, even if such military action or cyber sabotage, whatever category this would fall under, can set back the program temporarily, it does not have the ability to change the trajectory of the program. On the contrary, it tends to intensify it. When the Trump administration left the JCPOA, the Iranians went above 367. When the Israelis assassinated Fakhrizadeh, the Iranians went to 20%. Once they bombed Natanz, they went to 60%. This is an escalatory cycle that ultimately is tremendously detrimental to Europe, tremendously detrimental to the United States, and detrimental to the very prospects of being able to resolve the nuclear issue.
Thank you. Thank you, Trita. Now maybe I see there is a hand raised, so I would ask maybe my colleagues to unmute John Palmer. John, can you hear us? Could you just introduce yourself and quickly pose your question? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. You can hear me? Good.
Yes,
I was a founder of the EPC, retired now, but taking a great interest at a little longer distance with the issues that you've been discussing. And thank you very much for some really clear expositions of current attitudes on the contentious questions. Two-part question. There's sort of bad news and maybe some sign of some movement towards better news. The bad news is Sahel, where perhaps belatedly we're becoming aware of the precarity of the security situation across the whole of the sub-Saharan belt from west to east in the continent, and with implications for potential destabilization further south, certainly in Nigeria, maybe in other West African countries. Any thoughts that you've got on that? The second thing is more nuanced. There certainly is no sign of any political preparedness to confront the basic fundamental unresolved issue of Israel-Palestine. But I have been struck, be interested in Daniel Kurtzer's view on this, I have been struck by what seems to me to be a significant shift of opinion in the United States Jewish community, or important parts of the United States Jewish community, to a more distant and even critical stance towards the Israeli government, and in particular, some of the more contentious actions taken in the policing of the occupied territories. My question is, will that have any effect in modulating US policy in future?
Thank you, John. Maybe Dan, would you like to take maybe the second question?
Sure. There certainly is a fair degree of ferment within the American Jewish community and within the Democratic Party with respect to US policy on the Israel-Palestine question. But I think we're at a fairly early stage of change. For example, in the Democratic Party, the number of very outspoken critics of Israeli policy is still minimal. I think the so-called squad in Washington now has 7 or 8 members of Congress, and that's a very small, although quite vocal minority. So far, the mainstream of the Democratic Party, as well as the Republican Party, remain pretty much focused on the traditional aspects of American policy, which is support for Israel and rejection of the claims that some have of Israeli policy being equivalent of apartheid or whatever. Within the American Jewish community, there's the distinction between concerns about Israeli policy and voting patterns. The Jewish community voted overwhelmingly for Biden, as it has for Democratic candidates in almost every election for the last about 50 years. Although there are increasing voices calling on Israel both to moderate its approach to Palestinians, its settlement activities, and in particular concerns about the direction of Israeli domestic policy. The legitimization, for example, of the far right-wing parties has been of particular concern within some parts of the American Jewish community, which is also concerned about the rise of far-right politics here in the United States. So it's an issue. It's going to be part of the domestic political debate as it relates to Israel-Palestine, but I think we're at a relatively early stage, and it's a question of where it goes. I'd add one point. There was a publication today of a Human Rights Watch report on Israeli policy, not only in the occupied territories, but in Israel proper, which accuses Israel of being an apartheid state that has committed crimes against humanity. This will satisfy some people, but it will largely, I think, coalesce opinion within the American Jewish community, even among opponents of Israeli policy. There are very few in the American Jewish community who believe that Israel is an apartheid state or has committed crimes against humanity. And that outside evaluation is likely to unify ranks within the community rather than stimulate further debate.
And John, I think there's also another question on Sahel, if I understood correctly, on the implications of the threats from Sahel. Does anyone want to tackle this?
Well, I would note, just to jump in, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, a focus for the United States, even in this prioritization of domestic politics, remains counterterrorism. And so what happens in Mali and Chad, or the southern reaches of Libya and elsewhere, remains of significant concern to the U.S. counterterrorism community. We've seen, largely as a result of casualties, we've seen where American forces are located, which we didn't even know about. And we are apparently deployed in a variety of places, working with local armies and local law enforcement to try to curb that threat. And I think John's exactly right that this is not only not going away, but it is part of the phenomenon where these groups are seeping into places where governance is so weak or absent entirely. And, you know, as the expression goes, where borders are porous. So it will remain a concern, and it'll largely be focused on the security side of things. I would make the argument that if you really want to get at the problem, you have to go beyond security and work at building up the capacity of governments to govern and to produce jobs and food security. But I think for the short term, we're talking mostly about a counterterrorism strategy, particularly in that area of the Sahel, Sub-Sahara.
Thank you, Dan, for jumping in on this question as well. I see in the question box a couple of questions, but maybe before going into those, I will turn back to you, Lina, and ask you something. I've seen that recently you and your colleagues have got out a publication on Middle East. It also touches upon confidence building measures in the region. What would be the role of these confidence building measures in the region? How would they look like in practice?
Okay, thanks. I mean, we're calling for further engagement. And here I will have to disagree with our colleague here, Trita, who's basically saying, actually, it's not such a bad thing that the US is not really engaging. I mean, yes, on the surface, it looks like Iraq is brokering talks, as Trita mentioned, with Iran and Saudi, and that is a good thing because the regional actors need to bear responsibility for where they are. However, I don't see a contradiction between this kind of thing happening and the US being engaged in such a process. I don't see why the US should be absent. If anything, I think the United States disengagement in the region has opened up space for other actors like Russia, in particular Russia, to play a destabilizing role in the region and to kind of find a space for itself to assert itself vis-a-vis the West in general. And I don't think that this is in the US interest. So here we have a vacuum in a way, a political vacuum created by US disengagement. Therefore, when it comes to confidence building measures, I think we need direct engagement by the United States so that we don't really, in the end, offer the Middle East to actors like Russia on a plate.
Rita, would you like to come in for a comment?
Yeah, I would love to. First of all, love to see more of your cat. Don't hide it. We only saw the tail of it. I think it would be, first of all, I'm not against US engagement. I think that's very important to clarify. I think the United States should stay engaged. However, it's about that the United States, whether it needs to constantly play the leadership role. I think the effort to constantly play the leadership role has actually taken away agency from regional powers to do what they're doing now. And I think the pattern is quite fascinating. As much as we would like them to engage while the United States is also showing that leadership, it doesn't tend to happen. When the United States is that engaged, it seems to be preferable for some of them to essentially just hide behind the United States, hoping that the United States would engage militarily and resolve those problems militarily rather than diplomatically. And I have to say, I can understand if you're sitting in Riyadh right now and you have the option of the United States essentially taking care of your problem with Iran militarily, compared to you having to engage in painful negotiations that will ultimately, inevitably have to lead to compromises that you would not like to make, yes, then it is clearly preferable to go with the American option. So it's not only until that option no longer exists that we see the incentivization of some of the regional partners of the United States in moving towards diplomacy. And I don't think that should be a mystery. It's unfortunate, but it is the way it is. And I think the United States should certainly remain engaged. But I wouldn't be so terribly worried about this idea of vacuums, etc. Yes, the Russians have increased some of their influence, etc. But we should take a step back and remember one thing. The whole last 25 years of American leadership of the region have not been particularly successful. The region suffered from 5 military conflicts in 1998. In 2019, that number was up to 22. Obviously, it's not all of the fault of the United States, but the United States was the leading military force during this period. But for a lack of a better word, it was the hegemon, and this is the track record under its hegemony. It's not particularly attractive. So the idea that we should just stick with that because it's good, I don't buy. It's insufficient. It's not good enough. And the idea that the Russians or others would come in, I personally find it a little bit exaggerated. And to the extent that they have come in, why have they been able to do so? Is it because the United States left militarily, or is it because at the end of the day, United States' military engagement in the region has turned it into a belligerent, and as a result, it has closed off a lot of its diplomatic options. The Russians are in direct communications with almost all actors in the Middle East, whereas the United States has cut off relations with numerous parties in the region, and as a result, doesn't have the same diplomatic influence. So if you want to see leadership, it seems to me that leadership, the diplomatic leadership, tends to actually be hampered by the United States taking such a prominent military role, because that prominent military role leads to it becoming a belligerent rather than a peacemaker.
Maybe just a quick follow-up on external powers in the region here, and maybe I would address it to you, Trita. How should we understand China's behavior in the region? We saw the recent agreement with Iran. We saw increased cooperation with the Gulf region. How should we see this increased presence of China in the region?
Well, the Chinese have an interest economically, and so far their engagement has been essentially exclusively economic. A lot of noise has been made about the agreement that the Iranians signed with the Chinese, and I think that is to a certain extent because the Iranians want to play it up. They want to play it up to signal the Europeans and the Americans that they have other options. But that agreement is no different from the agreement that the Saudis signed with the Chinese in 2016. The Turks have already signed it. The Iranians are actually one of the last to sign that type of an agreement with the Chinese. It does certainly make it more difficult for those who still have the pipe dream that one can indefinitely isolate Iran. Certainly in that context, that deal is not insignificant. But does it lead to Chinese entry to the region, etc.? I find those things at times politically motivated by folks in Washington who just want to keep troops everywhere and are afraid that if they leave, others come in. Ultimately, I have to say, for the Persian Gulf in particular, to be able to be fully secure and have a security architecture that is durable, I think it would be quite critical to make sure that the United States is involved, but also that the Chinese and other Asian powers that are actually consuming the energy from the Persian Gulf are involved. They have a direct interest in this. And as a result, having them involved is better than not having them involved because that can create all kinds of other headaches. The United States is not consuming that much of that. I think it's less than 15% right now, whereas 40% of it is of China's energy consumption is coming from the Persian Gulf. So inevitably, they're going to have an interest in this. Any attempt to try to exclude them is actually going to be a point of tension that could be quite detrimental.
Lina, Dan, would you have any comment on Russia's and China's presence in the region? Any follow-up, maybe?
Can I just clarify that when I talk about US disengagement, I'm not talking about military disengagement. I'm talking about diplomatic disengagement primarily. And so to go back to what Trita said about Russia, it is not US military disengagement that opened up space for Russia to play such a significant role in Syria. It is diplomatic disengagement. Had the US had the political will from the very beginning in 2011 to not let the Syrian crisis descend into conflict, we would not have been in the situation we are in today. Russia would not have seen an opportunity for itself in 2015 to enter militarily and use its military position in Syria to try to force a political outcome that's favorable to it. So what I'm calling for is, again, and here, Trita, we actually do agree. I am calling for US engagement with all actors diplomatically. I don't think military presence or military action is the way to go. Having said that, I think it is important that the US currently retains troops in, say, northeast Syria, because otherwise this would be simply handing over that region to Iran and its allies and making the border with Iraq porous, and therefore contributing to further destabilization in Iraq, which is ultimately not in the US interest. However, I am not advocating for military engagement by any means. Thank you.
I would offer two comments. One, I don't think it was the United States that could have prevented the deterioration of the situation in Syria in 2011. I know there's a major debate about American policy at that time. I argued in 2011 for US-Russian cooperation in trying to deal with the situation. And frankly, that was not available from either side, neither from the American side nor the Russian side. And so the Syrian issue, I think, is one of those places where I, who am normally a bit of a critic of American policy, would not blame the United States for the deterioration. I also want to pick up on the last comment of Trita about the security architecture in the Gulf. Since the 1980s, the United States has been the primary, if not actually the sole guarantor of security of oil and gas exports from the Gulf. And it's now out of whack, as Trita noted, how little the United States draws on those energy assets. But that also doesn't take into account the security umbrella which the United States has helped to provide for our Gulf allies. And that's where this question comes up of whether or not there's room in the Gulf security architecture for Russia and China to play a larger role. On the one hand, they should be paying for the security of the exports, or China in this case, should be paying for the security of exports that they're exploiting. On the other hand, what would the United States do in the competition for access and the security of Gulf allies? And so it's a major policy debate. It's a place where, in fact, there are three current proposals for security architecture on the table. I wrote a piece on this about a year ago. There's an Iranian proposal, a Russian proposal, and an American proposal. And it's almost like they're in three different universes. So the first place to start would be to see whether or not there's any common language to think about a security architecture, but it would have to take into account not only the security of fossil fuel exports, but also the security of Gulf states themselves.
Thank you, Dan, for chipping in the discussion. I would maybe now turn to the Q&A. There is a first question which I think is addressed to you, Dan. It's from Yossi Lemkovitz, who's asking, Palestinian elections are likely to be canceled. Would this be a way to prevent Hamas to win?
Well, if they're canceled, it's not going to be because of an effort to prevent Hamas from winning. I think President Abbas is meeting today or scheduled tomorrow to talk about postponing the elections, in large part because of the ineffectiveness of the Fatah party to promote a single list. Among the 36 electoral lists that have registered for the election, there are at least 3 that are Fatah lists, which means that, as in 2006, when different Fatah candidates ran against Hamas, which had a unified list, they ended up killing each other off in many districts. So without the unity of the party itself, they could be heading towards a significant defeat, whether or not Hamas would objectively do well. There are still two issues on the table. One is the question of voting in Jerusalem, and the other is the candidacy requirements that the Central Electoral Commission has put forward. Neither of those issues has yet been resolved, but I would make the argument that this is an internal Fatah problem, and we may see a postponement simply because they can't get their act in order.
Maybe I'll just move now to another question, which is addressed to Trita from Eldar Mamedov. And he's saying it's just a longer text, so I'll just read it out loud. So Biden is proving to be, to some extent, a foreign policy restrainer, announcing pullout from Afghanistan and intention to rejoin the nuclear deal with Iran. What do you think will be the implications for that for the Republican Party? Do you expect more Republican voices joining the restrained camp?
Thank you so much. I'm not sure I would go as far as Eldar has in the sense of calling him a restrainer. Certainly pulling out of Afghanistan fits in with that. And certainly it's not just a decision, it's the motivation that he put forward that I think sows the seed for making it more difficult actually to defend keeping troops in many other places. So I think in that sense, Biden definitely moved in that direction. I'm not seeing him, for instance, being much of a restrainer necessarily on China, on other areas, but clearly when it comes to the Middle East, I think this is, again, as I mentioned earlier on, these are some of the perspectives I think he had himself before, but it's also a reaction to political realities. It is extremely unpopular, increasingly unpopular, particularly with younger Americans, for the US's continued military engagement in the Middle East. It's quite fascinating to see how the polls have played out after the withdrawal from Afghanistan. I think the Economist polls show that it was roughly 60% support. And this is after big parts of Washington's foreign policy establishment, nevertheless, were very, very negative towards that decision. It's been fascinating to see that a lot of Republicans actually have supported the president on this issue. Bipartisanship has kind of set aside on that issue. And I think it's mainly because at the end of the day, the Republican inclination in this direction is not coming out of some sort of a necessarily intellectual journey. It's coming from pressures from their constituencies. A lot of these districts are places where a lot of soldiers have come from, where there's a lot of problems and there's a sense of tremendous neglect and a tremendous anger because at least in the case of Iraq, the whole war was based on a lie. In the case of Afghanistan, staying has been based on continuous falsehoods presented by the government. We saw that very clearly with the Washington papers that came out about a year ago. So just criticizing Biden on this or moving away from it is not an easy choice for many of these Republicans because their constituencies really do want to pull out. I think on Iran, it's going to be a completely different issue, however, because there, the Republican Party has really staked out a position. There's plenty of factors that is behind their position, and that's not going to change easily, but it will change, I suspect, if this actually goes closer to a real military confrontation. At that point, I think you will see some of these things changing. It is one, I thought it was, give me an example, quite fascinating to see how Senator Lindsey Graham have been tremendously hawkish on the Iran issue. But when it came to Trump consulting about the idea of assassinating Soleimani, even the uber hawk Lindsey Graham was counseling Trump not to do it because he was afraid that it would lead to a broader war. So I think Iran and being extremely hawkish on it has a tremendous amount of political, financial, and other types of benefits as long as it stops short of war. Once it crosses that threshold, the politics of this will change.
Would you like to jump in, Dan, Lina, on this question? Okay, maybe I'll just turn back to you, Lina, as I have another question to another issue, which is the U.S. policy towards Yemen. How should we assess this policy, and is there maybe an increased role for the EU in the near future?
Yes, I mean, when it comes to Yemen, of course, there is a security link between the Sahel and Yemen. So we can't really say now there is concern about security in Africa and forget that Yemen, is actually geographically not that far away across the sea in Asia. And therefore, I think it's important to pay attention to Yemen and the broader cross-border security framework. The other issue, of course, is that Yemen is a country witnessing the Houthis play a significant role in this conflict. And the Houthis are supported by Iran, but the Houthis are not Hezbollah. The Houthis are not the popular mobilization units in Iraq. They are not as essential for Iran. And that means that Yemen can be a place where resolving this conflict might see Iran agreeing to a degree of compromise. And I think this can be a positive thing to use in any negotiations about Iran's regional role in the Middle East. And here I think the United States can definitely work with Europe to play a role. Already we have a European basically in the UN who is the special envoy for Yemen, and he is playing a really tremendous role with a lot of European involvement and of course the UN itself. So I see here Yemen being perhaps the starting point to show how US engagement and European engagement can, with the United Nations, lead to a positive outcome, show that Iran can compromise. But also we haven't talked much about Saudi Arabia in this conversation. Obviously, Saudi's involvement in the Yemen conflict is crucial and has been very damaging. And so it is Saudi Arabia that also has to compromise for a conflict to be resolved. And therefore, I think with this administration, with Saudi Arabia already giving some signs that it wants to accommodate certain US demands, I think there is a possibility that Saudi Arabia will be open to compromise with US pressure. So I see some indicators that there is a positive role that can be played by everyone in this particular conflict.
Trita, any thoughts on this?
Well, I do agree with Lina that, obviously for any solution there to happen, the role of the Saudis have to be directly addressed, and the issue of the blockade is now forefront, and there's growing pressure in the US Congress, in the United States as a whole, that the steps that Biden took in preventing sales of what was called offensive weapons to the Saudis is insufficient, and that in particular something needs to be done about the blockade, mindful of its humanitarian impact. This goes back to also what we talked about early on. Apparently, based on the reporting, the discussions that have been held in Iraq between the Iranians, the Saudis, Jordanians, Egyptians, have been primarily focused on Yemen. And this is essential because, unfortunately, this war in Yemen will not come to a full stop unless you have some sort of an agreement in which both the Iranians and the Saudis withdraw their support and their involvement in that conflict. And the fact that that dialogue is now taking place is quite positive. Whether it will be successful or not remains to be seen. It seems to be quite embryonic, but it's encouraging to see that we're now in a situation in which I think the Saudis in particular are actively trying to find a way out of this conflict, probably a safe way, face-saving way out, and hopefully that path will be given to them.
If I might, I would jump in and just add a word on Saudi Arabia. The concern of the Biden administration with respect to Saudi Arabia is not limited to the situation in Yemen. There is a very strong view within the administration that Saudi human rights performance needs to be held up to the light. We saw it with the release of the Khashoggi report, which the reaction maybe didn't go far enough as many people had suggested. But the fact is that this administration believes that certainly the Trump administration had given the Saudis a free pass on human rights performance that are inimical to American interests. So there's almost a separate Saudi agenda item that's yet to be determined in a policy sense. I think it will get wrapped up in the situation in Yemen, but Yemen will not be the only factor that motivates American policy in this regard.
I think this has been an excellent exchange so far. So thank you very much for all the insights. As we're going closer to the end, maybe I'll just pose one last question to all of you, and we'll go in reverse order compared to the beginning with Trita, with you, Dan, and at the end we'll finish with Lina. Maybe looking ahead at the next 5 to 10 years, specialists who do forecasts, they tend to look at the emerging risks in the region. Maybe I would pose the question a bit differently. What would be the emerging opportunities in the region for the next 5 to 10 years that you see?
I would say, risking repeating myself, but I do believe that the decision by the United States to shift focus elsewhere without abandoning the region diplomatically, but reducing its profile there, does provide an opportunity for the regional states to step up and start resolving their own problems themselves, and hopefully come to a solution that, precisely because they were owning and driving that process, will be deeper anchored in the region's politics, and as a result can help stabilize the region. I think the constant search for an outside player to provide security for the region may provide temporary respite, but will ultimately not create durable security. And as a result, there is an opportunity right now where the regional states have the maturity and the decisiveness to be able to capitalize on it. Remains to be seen.
I would offer a comment on one of the issues that we have not discussed today, and that is the normalization agreements between Israel and 4 Arab countries, Bahrain, UAE, Sudan, and Morocco. I don't think they are as important as some people argue, but I think they are important, and they may indicate a trend towards the Arab states looking much more to self-interest than to pan-Arab positions. The fact of the matter is the UAE accomplished something in the normalization. It was stopping an annexation policy by Israel that may not have taken place anyway. But the reality is that Bahrain, Sudan, and Morocco went into this for reasons that had nothing to do with the Palestinian issue. They got something out of it from the United States, but it also reflected the fact that there's now going to be an opening for these countries to work together with Israel in the open on technology and security and intelligence cooperation. It's hard to see that this will be a kind of a landslide of everybody joining in. I think further normalization will proceed slowly, but in a 10-year horizon, I think that's one of the most significant changes to watch, which is the idea of Israel becoming a factor in the foreign policy priorities of Arab states, apart from, although related to, the Palestinian issue.
Okay, final thoughts, since we only have less than a minute, is to say that we should always focus on the big picture. My criticism of US foreign policy and EU foreign policy towards the Middle East is that very often they are very short-term, not long-term, whereas some regional actors like Iran actually design their policies on a long-term basis. So the West ends up playing catch-up all the time. The other issue is addressing symptoms of the problem rather than the problem. So focusing on terrorism, yes, is an immediate issue. However, unless we address the real grievances and key drivers that have to do with governance and political disenfranchisement and economic disadvantages and all that, we're not really going to solve the problem. We're only going to be postponing it, and therefore end up in a similar cycle 10 years down the line, 20 years down the line. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think there are like so many issues. I think we could continue this conversation for another couple of hours, but unfortunately we have to close here. So I would take this opportunity to thank you very much, Lina, Dan, and Trita, for this wonderful conversation. I would like also to thank our audience, and I'm looking forward to the next conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.